Some Nations. Section: Eurocentric Communism. During the interwar period, the foreign policy of the Soviet Union shifted its focus from fomenting and consolidating revolutionary momentum in the imperialist countries to forging ties with national revolutionary movements in the colonial world and neighboring states in the East. This helped to inspire and consolidate militant internationalism and a break from the colonialist reformism characteristic of social democracy, which very largely left the field open to communist forces in the colonial world. The Comintern, Communist or Third International, was established in 1919 by the minority of Marxists, who considered that the old parties of the left had thoroughly discredited the cause of socialism by supporting the imperialist policies of their own capitalist governments, before, during, and after the First World War. However, after an initial period in which it paid much greater attention to the revolutionary liberation movements in the colonial and semi-colonial countries, the Comintern reverted to standard Marxian Eurocentrism. By the end of the First World War, the metropolitan labor aristocracy had not overthrown capitalism, as many Bolsheviks had anticipated, and had left the Soviet Union isolated to fend for itself in an extremely hostile international environment. Under the circumstances, the Soviet aim of averting an imperialist invasion of its borders ensured its willingness to uphold the spheres of influence of the imperialist powers of the time. Referring to Comintern support for imperialist country social patriotism, Redfern summarizes the Soviet strategy following the 1933 Nazi electoral victory in Germany. Quote, "If the workers in Britain and France would not embrace communism, why not mobilize their patriotism in the cause of the defense of the Soviet Union?" End quote. Thus, for instance, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution, the Comintern urged the working class of Britain and France to demand that their governments defend their colonial empires in the East, quote, "menaced by Japanese imperialism," end quote. Contrastingly, the Chinese Revolution of 1949 was achieved by a communist party that flouted the line propounded by the Comintern, as it became imperative to break the united front with the Chinese nationalists. Footnote. Mavrakis writes, quote, "The policy of working within the Kuomintang nationalists was, after all, perfectly correct in the framework of the struggle against imperialism and the militarists. It gave a colossal impetus to the mass movements in the towns and the countryside. Li Tachao and Mao Zedong had carried out this policy enthusiastically for reasons quite independent of Comintern instructions." End of quote and end of footnote. To put it mildly, the workers of the imperialist countries did not respond with alacrity to the 1920 Second Comintern Congress's insistence that they take up the cause of the national liberation of the colonies. Indeed, a few months after the Congress, V.I. Lenin reported that he had instructed a delegation of English workers on this obligation, but, quote, "they made faces. They simply could not get into their heads the truth that in the interests of the world revolution, workers must wish the defeat of their own government." End quote. The record of Western European communist parties shows that despite their being far to the left of mainstream social democratic parties on the question of opposition to imperialism, they fell short of consistent internationalism. Although compared with its first, the Second Comintern Congress definitely witnessed a, quote, "qualitative leap" in its appreciation of the significance of the colonial question. This was not, quote, "reflected in any sustained effort by the Comintern, either on the theoretical plane or that of practical activity. The Eurocentrist viewpoint continued to predominate in the leadership of the Comintern and in the communist parties of the metropolitan countries." End quote. Indeed, from its foundation onwards, the Comintern tended to grossly overestimate the revolutionary potential of the European working class, which supported conservative and social democratic parties in its great majority. Despite considerable attention paid by the Comintern to the revolutionary movement in the East, Its preoccupation throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s was with Europe, and increasingly so as the years rolled on. Thus, in 1924, Vietnamese communist Ho Chi Minh noted, beginning of long quote, "As for our communist parties in Great Britain, Holland, Belgium, and other countries, what have they done to cope with the colonial invasions perpetrated by the bourgeois class of their countries? What have they done from the day they accepted Lenin's political program to educate the working class of their countries in the spirit of just internationalism, and that of close contact with the working masses in the colonies? What our parties have done in this domain is almost worthless. As for me, I was born in a French colony, and am a member of the French Communist Party, and I am very sorry to say that our Communist Party has done hardly anything for the colonies. It is the task of the communist newspapers to introduce the colonial question to our militants, to awaken the working masses in the colonies, win them over to the cause of communism. But what have our newspapers done? Nothing at all." End of long quote from Ho Chi Minh. In August 1936, the Italian Communist Party, PCI newspaper, Stato Operaio, Worker State, published its leader Palmiro Togliatti's L'Appello ai Fascisti, Appeal to the Fascists, in which he signally condemned the invasion of Ethiopia a year earlier, not for the misery it had caused to Ethiopians. The war had resulted in around 760,300 Ethiopian deaths, but for the disappointing paucity of benefits the war actually brought to, amongst others, the volunteers who fought there, and the black-shirt rank and file. Togliatti indeed declared that, quote, "Communists, rather than Mussolini's government, do justice to the fascist program of 1919, which is a program of freedom." End quote. A decade later, in 1946, as Minister of Justice, Togliatti passed an amnesty for all Italian fascists. The PCI, led by Palmiro Togliatti, enthusiastically participated in the post-war Italian government, despite its being an imperialist one. In the same year, the PCI demanded the restitution of Italy's colonies and the reoccupation of Eritrea, Somalia, and Libya, since, according to Togliatti and Pietro Nenni, the National Secretary of the Italian Socialist Party, Italy had a Popular Front government, not an imperialist one, and the Italian proletariat was destined to lead the colonies into independence. In 1949, the PCI openly supported Italy's joining NATO. End of section.